Good evening. Welcome to the Rosenbach's online Irish authors presentation. My name's Elizabeth Fuller. I'm the librarian at the Rosenbach. I'll be assisted tonight behind the scenes for the most part by my colleague Andrew White, our volunteer coordinator, and your chat leprechaun for the night, and Emily Parker, our director of education and interpretation. I am joining you, by the way, from the top of the Martello Tower, where Ulysses takes place. This is the image courtesy of the Joyce Museum at Sandy Cove. And Andrew, I believe, is virtually in W.B. Yeats's tower room. I'm at the Rosenbach on site today. Andrew working from home, but we can be virtually anywhere, and I know that our visitors are all over the world, so thank you very much. If you have questions or comments as we go along, please put them in the chat, and they'll be fed to me, and I will answer them as I can. We have the next slide, please. Here we go. Let's go on to the next one, please, and talk for just a moment about what the Rosenbach is. For some who are joining us for the first time, we're a museum and a special collections library in Philadelphia near Rittenhouse Square. We're based on the collections of two brothers, Philip and A.S.W. Rosenbach, known as Dr. Rosenbach, who were dealers for the first half of the 20th century in rare books and manuscripts and fine and decorative arts. The library collections that Dr. Rosenbach amassed are especially strong in American history and English literature. We have also fine and decorative arts that Philip collected, as well as books and manuscripts in other categories. We've got the next slide, please. We'll start in on the topic of the evening. English literature is one of those shorthands, at least in American parlance, that it's not a comfortable handle for this topic, really. What it means is English language literature of the British Isles. In addition to English authors, we have great Irish authors that we'll be talking about tonight, and many others. We've got Robert Burns and Robert Louis Stevenson and Dylan Thomas and other Scots and Welsh writers too, but they live under the banner of English lit here. Dr. Rosenbach didn't collect Irish literature as such, but he knew that a lot of the greatest writers in English are Irish, and so naturally they are included in our collections. He only traveled to Ireland once in 1928 when he was buying books from a number of country house libraries, not necessarily Irish literature, but a lot of great books. We've got a topic here, the core of our collections, as that last point, were acquired by Dr. Rosenbach. We have added to them since. When we bring new things into the collection, we build on his interests and expand on what's already here. So I will try to note as we go along what things we have bought and acquired since his day. We have the next slide. I should talk a little bit about what makes literature Irish, and a disclaimer here: I am not deeply versed in Irish history, so we're just a couple of observations and very broad generalizations as things to keep in mind when we go through.
Elizabeth,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Roislene has a question, wondering whether we have much in Irish or any of the other Celtic languages at the Rosenbach.
Very, very little. There is that was not a strength, particular interest of Dr. Rosenbach's, and we haven't expanded a lot. I know that there is an early 17th or 18th century translation of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress into Irish is the one book I can think, and we have very, very recently acquired the first Irish edition of Dracula. Translated into Irish. Those are the two things that I know of. This feeds very, very beautifully into our next some of the next points. I mean, Irish, there's a very strong storytelling and oral literature tradition in Ireland. And storytelling is something the Irish certainly love. And so stories, writing down those stories is the next step. History and politics are sometimes they're right in the foreground of the literature itself. They always shape the culture that writers come out of and the circumstances of writers and the reasons we have, the writers are who they are. From the 12th century, the English started trying to claim Ireland. And beginning in the 17th century, they were bringing in additional Protestants, not always of their own free will. The English were solving the problem of people in Scotland by the problems they perceived from people in Scotland by moving them over to Ireland. So there were the issue of Protestants planted in Ireland comes from is part of English imperial politics. In the mid 17th century, Oliver Cromwell's Puritan government of England moved into Ireland and imposed a lot of really harsh measures, and from then their control over Ireland grew. There was always pushback. There were waves of revolt and resistance and reform that went back and forth. But for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Anglo-Irish, not even most of the Protestant settlers who were Scottish Presbyterians, other English non-Anglicans, but the Anglo-Irish aristocracy really had a near monopoly on the ability to vote, which was tied to the ability to own land. They had 95% of the land. They were really the only ones who could get university education or take part in the professions. So that's all of our authors except the last tonight are from Anglo-Irish backgrounds. Language, again, is, language talk is another great characteristic, a national characteristic of Ireland. And the Irish language, it has a long history and fortunately a great revival in the last century. And there's a vivid oral literature in it, well, a lot of which has been written down, and there's written literature in it too. But for writers who wanted an audience outside of Ireland, they had to publish in English, and there was a lot of people didn't end up the Anglo-Irish were not speaking Irish as much, and a lot of gradually because Irish was de-emphasized, if not actually punished in education, and English was needed for the professions. The language through a lot of the 19th century really became much less widely spoken. So a lot of Irish people in recent centuries have felt, even if English is their only language, it's not their language. They may speak it. They may not speak it. They don't speak Irish. English is their language, but somehow there's many of them. Yeah. There's a great, a very ambivalent relationship with English very often. Most of the writers we'll see are writing in English. Let's we have the next slide, please. We'll dig into people. Our first, no, before we do that, we've only got 6 people tonight, all men as it happens, but we have more Irish writers represented in the collections. We can never get enough time to show you all the great things we have. So we always have to pick and choose. We are hoping to expand and add another Irish writers presentation that will bring some more of these people. And I'm not going to go over all these names, but if you spot recognize any of these, there may be a chance later, or certainly feel free to ask us any questions about them. Thank you. Let's have the next slide, and we'll dig into our first writer finally, Jonathan Swift. Best known as a satirist, although he wrote prose also. He was born during this period when the English were really clamping down on the majority of the population. He was Anglo-Irish, like most of our writers. 3 of his 4 grandparents were, all of his grandparents were born in England, as his father was. He was a priest in the Protestant Church of Ireland, the Irish counterpart of the Church of England. Eventually was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. He was a very political animal. He was very very close with the leading English politicians of the day. As a Protestant clergyman, he was not at all a fan of Catholicism. He didn't have good things to say about it, but he did defend the Irish people's basic rights against horrible English economic oppression. So he's Protestant though he is, he's always held in great regard by the Irish people. We just have 2 of his books. But one of them is certainly a book that you have heard of, even if you've never heard of it, even if you haven't read it. We'll have the next slide and see if you recognize it from the title. You'll notice that Swift's name is not on the title page, but it is well known under its pseudonymous by the name of its narrator. I'll just ask people to share for a minute. Yes, yep. Rasheen has Gulliver's Travels. If you'd like to share in the chat for a minute, just what pictures come into your head when you think of this book. Oh my. I see. Yep, Lilliputians. I know, yep. I know I have a picture that must have come from some children's adaptation that I don't remember the book clearly, but I have one picture in my head of large Gulliver lying down on the beach, tied down with ropes, and little people walking all over him. Yes. Somebody else said yes, the Gulliver tied down to the ground, right? I see that someone has mentioned, let's go to our next, this, by the way, this is a copy of the first edition from 1726. It was popular immediately. It went through 4 printings in English in the first year, within which it was also translated into Dutch, French, and German. If we can have the next slide, we'll have a look inside volume 2, the story, the account of the Houyhnhnms. I see somebody mentioned that up there. If you are not familiar with them, Gulliver traveled to a number of different countries, not just Lilliput, but several other places. At the top there is the name of the people in the last place he visited, the Houyhnhnms. Gulliver's Travels is a satire, a pretty sharp one. Many of his satires were overtly political. This one isn't. It's just about human foibles in general, our pettiness in Lilliput and our grandiosity in Brobdingnag. And the Houyhnhnms are they are horse. They look like horses. Yes,
Elizabeth,
they have a ways. Yes.
we have an interesting question from Rosalind, who says, do we think that Swift thought his book would be so popular among children?
That's a good question. I don't know. Certainly there was precedent. There weren't in the early 18th century yet a lot of books written specifically for children. Some instructional books, some didactic books, but definitely Pilgrim's Progress, which was published about 40 years, if I remember correctly, 40 years or so before Gulliver. Pilgrim's Progress, which is a Christian allegory, which has a lot of dull passages, but it has also it was very popular, and probably the one book that households had if they had one book besides a Bible. And it also has fights with monsters and giants and so on, and children did read those passages. It was the stuff that interested them that was around. So Swift was probably aware of the potential, but I don't know how much he thought about it. So the Houyhnhnms are, well, they look like horses. They just look like horses. They are human. They are really what humans ought to be. They are cultivated. They are civilized. They're the best of people. In the next slide, we'll look in detail at a passage that describes the when Gulliver first gets a look at one of their work animals. He's seen these things at a distance, but finally brought them close up. The master horse ordered a sorrel nag, one of his servants, to untie the largest of these animals and take him into the yard. The beast and I were brought close together, and our countenances diligently compared, both by master and servant, who thereupon repeated several times the word Yahoo. My horror and astonishment are not to be described when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. Yahoos are not, they look like humans. They are not human. They have no language. They are filthy. They are violent. They are stupid. They are only fit for carrying burdens. This also is, and you will see italicized on the right-hand side of the line on the printed page there, about halfway down. It looks like taboo in that strange italic type, but that is the first time the word Yahoo ever appeared in print. It was not even a term in popular slang usage before then. Swift created this word, and to begin with, Yahoo is not a complimentary word at all. I don't know if anybody has ever been called a Yahoo, but it's probably because you were misbehaving, or eventually that it became a little less pejorative and just more sort of boisterous, uncouth people, and then noises of celebration. Yes.
We have a comment from Rosalind. There is a Wynnum horse farm in Chester County where they breed and train racehorses. They pronounce it Wynnum there. And Sean
Perfect.
says the S's do look like F's in this old font.
Yes, yes, they do. If I had, if you look on the, yeah, it is a different letter. There are, if you think about it, when we learn to read, there are two different shapes of lowercase a. We probably don't even think about that anymore because we're used to seeing both, and we know they're both a. Likewise, they're both s here. In the third line, you will see the third word is of, and the crossbar goes all the way across. But on the words just to the left and right of it, there are long s's, and there's just a tiny crossbar that only goes halfway, so you can tell the difference. But that is how you know. All right, let's go to the next slide, and we'll move on to our next author, who is someone who's very, his work directly less read now, but he worked in a huge number of genres. He wrote poems and plays and novels and children's books, as well as just popular versions, sort of translations and sort of rewritings for a popular audience of more classical or technical works. Oliver Goldsmith wandered around Europe for a while. He tried several professions before he settled in London. One of the many members of the Irish diaspora. He ended up as part of the circle of Samuel Johnson, and a lot of what we know about him is taken from James Boswell. Sorry, I blanked for a moment. James Boswell's biography of Johnson. It records both the very wonderful, complimentary, loving things Johnson had to say about him, and Boswell's own opinions, which are not always so favorable. But we have some of his best known works here. The Vicar of Wakefield. Even if you haven't read this, even if you haven't read it, if you read 19th century novels, you will know that most of the characters in those read the Vicar of Wakefield. A lot of other work that is still around. If we can have the next slide, though, we will look at one work here, which in some ways, his most enduring one. This you will notice from the date at the bottom of the title page, 1857. This particular book was published 80 years after he died, but it is an abridgment and adaptation of a book that he published during his lifetime. It was a History of the Earth and Animated Nature, which began as his attempt to translate and condense for an English audience a great work of natural history that was at the time, in fact, still being produced in France. A team headed by the Comte de Buffon was producing what was the first attempt since the Middle Ages to describe and classify all the animals of the world. Goldsmith, with his scientific background, is really most educated people in the late 18th century were interested in science and what was going on at the moment. And he thought that he would produce a version of Buffon for a general audience, and he did that. It was still a large book, 6 or 8 volumes. But makers of school books saw potential in this and said, this would be a great thing to adapt and condense further as a child's introduction to natural history. You'll see on the title page here, this one is Goldsmith's Natural History Abridged for the Use of Schools by Mrs. Pilkington, revised and corrected by a teacher of Philadelphia. So it's gone through a number of hands. But this particular book we're especially fond of because it was published by one M. Pollock, Moses Pollock, who is Dr. Rosenbach's uncle. In the next slide, we'll have a very, very quick look. In fact, I see we're a little short on time. The table of contents, which is a lot of fun, but we've the way he divides things: animals of the ruminating animals, animals of the sheep and goat kind, animals of the deer kind. My favorite, third down on the second page, animals of the prickly kind, hedgehogs, and so on. But the on the next page, we'll look at very briefly something. He was so this book was so well known. It gets a shout out in Moby Dick. One of the chapters of the monstrous pictures of whales, where our narrator Ishmael is telling people, is saying that nobody really knows what a whale looks like. Whales are in the ocean, and the only people who see them close up are trying to kill them while trying not to be killed by them. So all the pictures of whales are bad, and he's particularly calling out that popular work, Goldsmith's Animated Nature. In the abridged London edition of 1807, there are plates of an alleged whale and a narwhal. And next slide, please. We will see, this is not in our collection, but this is reproduced from that edition. You see the whale does, as he say, look much like an amputated sow. I think maybe it's that little fin at the top of its head that looks kind of like a pig's ear. But if the next slide, we will see Uncle Moe's whale, which looks even more amputated and definitely not drawn from life. Next slide, please. We'll move on to our third author, Oscar Wilde, another who worked in a huge variety of genres: poems, plays, a lot of criticism. He wrote some wonderful short stories. I didn't even put his one novel, a picture of Dorian Gray on it. He came from another Anglo-Irish family, though his mother was an influential Irish nationalist writer. A lot of there were prominent Anglo-Irish people in the Irish nationalist and independence movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. He's another who left home. He settled in London and became part of the aesthetic movement. You know, art is to be made for its own sake, and in fact, you should make your whole life a beautiful work of art. If we can condense, Oscar Wilde is eminently quotable, and it condensed so many things into a few words. Perhaps that's one way to condense him. He was also one of the first celebrities we talk now about as somebody who's well known for being well known. He first became known as a playwright, as a poet, I should say, and then by the end of his life, maybe best known as a playwright. We have both some of his poems and a few of his plays, well, Salome in particular, of which we have the manuscript. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll see the full portrait. That detail was taken from. This is how he looked when he visited Philadelphia in 1882 on his American tour. This was taken at the beginning of the tour in New York. He was not known in the United States yet, but very famous in England as a moving, yes, as one of the leading members of the aesthetic movement. He was actually in the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, Patience, yes, was the model for one of the characters in that. And when the D'Oyly Carte Company wanted to take the opera to America, someone decided, you know, to publicize it, we should get this guy. People don't know who he is yet, but he will. People will talk about him. He will be a curiosity, and he will raise a lot of awareness. Patience, thank you. Yes, will raise a lot of awareness for our new opera, Patience. So he toured around and lectured and did make quite a stir all over the country. He was in Philadelphia twice. And in fact, we have, yes, among the links Andrew has just put in chat is linked to the Oscar Wilde walking tour, which we offer on occasion. So if you're in the area, do check that out. The one thing from Wilde I want to show tonight is a letter that he wrote while he was in Philadelphia in 1882 to a friend in London, Elizabeth Lewis. Is that slide going to come up, or are we having some? We've had a few problems with some of these things loading. So yes, it's just a very brief note. Everything is going on brilliantly. I send you papers, newspapers, that is, regularly. Of course, they're full of lies, but you will not take them seriously. I go to see Walt Whitman at his invitation tomorrow. Tonight I lecture to 1,500 people. Best regards to Mr. Lewis and Mr. Burne-Jones. That's the artist, Edward Burne-Jones. Whitman had heard of this up-and-coming new poet, and Wilde, of course, had heard of Whitman. Whitman was living right across the river in Camden, New Jersey. And apparently the meeting went very, very well, because the person who had accompanied Wilde to the meeting was dismissed from the room soon after they arrived. Nobody really knows what went on. People who know something about the sexual orientation and interests of both of them have their ideas about what went on, but we won't know. But they did certainly hit it off beautifully. The next slide, please.
We had a question, Elizabeth. Rosalind wrote, I heard once about Wilde's actual walking stick ending up in the props department of Harvard University's theater and then getting stolen. Has anyone heard anything about that?
I have not, but that's a fabulous story. I will bet that our Rosenbach member John Cooper knows about that. He is a leading light in the Oscar Wilde Society and runs the blog Oscar Wilde in America.
That's right.
Yeah. I think it's oscarwildeinamerica.org. Don't quote me, but if you search for Oscar Wilde in America, you'll find it. And if it's not there, ask John.
I'll find
out for
you. I'll post John's blog in the chat. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Rosalind.
Okay, next. Yes. The Wilde family was friendly with the family of our next writer, Bram Stoker, who was just 7 years older than Wilde. Grew up in the same area of Dublin. Stoker started his professional career as a journalist and a theater critic. He settled in London and went to work for through his criticism. He met somebody he had idolized, Henry Irving, who was the one of the greatest actors of the day and the proprietor, the actor manager of the Lyceum Theater, which is still one of the great theaters in the West End. Stoker went to work for him as the business manager of the theater and put in tremendous amounts of work for the theater. But in his spare time, he continued to write and ended up transitioned to writing novels. We know him best for horror and mystery and speculative fiction, but he did a few historical and straight society novels. In Dr. Rosenbach's day, Stoker was not literature. So all the Stoker we acquired after his time. But in 1970, we bought the Stoker's research notes and outlines for Dracula. And we have continued to add to our Dracula and our vampire holdings since. We own a few letters on a few of his other writings as well. We have a number of programs and publications, and you will find, as Andrew has noted there, various links where you can find out more about Stoker and vampires and the Rosenbach. But let's have a look now at the next slide at some of these notes. There are about 120 pages of working material. Nobody knows where the manuscript, the actual handwritten draft of the text of the novel is. That seems not to have survived. Might turn up one day. There is a typescript, a typewritten version with a lot of heavy corrections in Stoker's hand. But here we've got the raw material. I always find it more fun to look at the guts, to see buildings while they're being built or when they're being torn down, to look inside things and to look at the working material. So I'm still, after a year of doing things virtually, I still point at my screen to show you things on this. So we'll have to see if Emily can point out for us a few things on this. This first page is a cast of characters, historiae personae, the history of the persons involved in this. He's continued to add people and subtract people as he goes along. Along the left, you have the roles that people play in this: the doctor of the madhouse, the girl engaged to him, etc. Over on the right, as he figures out the names of the people, as it were, the actors are going to play the roles. He worked in the theater, and it's thought he probably always had a theatrical adaptation in mind. Never came to pass, but he really hoped it would be adapted for the stage. So he seems to be working that way here. And right in the middle is the character of the Count. And first he is just, that word that's crossed out is Count Vampire. Very scary. But at some point, and we can see in a minute what point, he found the name Dracula and he liked it so much he not only put it there, but he wrote it 3 times at the top of the page. The next slide will show us where he got it. This is a page of typewritten notes that he made. Some poor typist had to transcribe his horrible handwriting, which he must have made handwritten notes first, on a book that he found in the library at Whitby in Yorkshire, a popular seaside resort where he had visited in the early 1890s. He found it in the library there. It's from a book that was published 70 years before he started writing Dracula in 1820. It's just a history of the areas near Transylvania, Wallachia and Moldavia, which are neighboring provinces in Romania. And these 2 notes are the only passages in the book that mention the historical ruler who was known by the nickname Dracula, who we may know today better as Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler. Interestingly, this book contains only some very bare facts. He fought against the Turks. He had a brother. He was in power and deposed and back in power and fought this battle, and that's about it. There's nothing in the book about, certainly nothing about vampires, because he wasn't connected with vampire lore at the time. And there's not even anything about impaling or any of the other cruelties that his enemies attributed to him. It's simply, there was a ruler with this name that Stoker obviously loved. And another kind of material that we find in these notes, we'll just, the next page very quickly, there's a page for each chapter of the book. Sometimes it's just a very few scrawled notes. They're not even full sentences here, but they're just a very few lines about what's going to happen in this chapter. The last 2 chapters are a little more fully described, and the second to last chapter we're particularly fond of because it's another Philadelphia artifact. I beg your pardon for the yawns. I didn't have any coffee at lunch. This is This was written at the, well, we don't know where it was written. We know where he got the paper. This is the Stratford Hotel at Broad and Walnut Streets in Philadelphia. If you know the area, it's the southwest corner. It's occupied by the building that was later known as the Bellevue Stratford and now just known as the Bellevue. It's a different building from when he was there, but he was in Philadelphia twice during the years. He was working on Dracula from 1890 to 1897. We know that from dates in the notes. Most of his other books haven't lasted as long, in part because he didn't take as much time with them. They're just not as good. Dracula is the one he really, really worked at over and over. So twice during those 7 years, the Lyceum Theater was on tour through Philadelphia. They toured all the time. They toured all over the place. If he didn't sit in his hotel room at Broad and Walnut and write down his ideas for the last 2 chapters, he swiped the stationery and did it later. Next slide, please. Here is a copy, one of the 2 copies we have of the first edition of Dracula, this wonderful lurid yellow cover. At the time, yellow covers were very often used for sensational literature. So you knew what kind of book you were likely to be getting when you saw this. Oh, I had not mentioned another connection between Wilde and Stoker. Their families knew each other growing up. One reason Oscar settled in London, actually, he was leaving Dublin when he found out that the woman he had been courting, Florence Balcombe, told him that she was going to marry Bram Stoker. Of course, they ended up in London anyway. Also, they grew apart for a while, but he actually did become friendly with Wilde again after his trial and visited him when he was living in exile in France in his last few years. Somebody else who knew the Wilde family is our next writer. On the next slide, William Butler Yeats. Chiefly known as a poet, he also wrote some plays, and actually in addition to literature, one of the chief ways he thought of himself was as an astrologer. He stayed in Ireland and was he was very heavily involved in the Irish literary revival. One of the leaders, and not only poet, playwright, and astrologer, but a politician. He was a member of the Senate in the first in the newly independent Ireland. He was culture and politics were very much intertwined for him. We have 2 manuscript poems. We also have, which I didn't get on this edit of the slide, we have 4 or 5 of his books that belong to the poet Marianne Moore, so as a part of her library rather than kept with the rest of the English literature. Yeats was a great admirer of Wilde, and even before he met Oscar and saw him his writing. He admired also very much Wilde's mother's work. She was more of a political animal than Oscar, and so more in line with Yeats's own taste. Yeats, especially at the beginning of his career, was very much inspired, as perhaps the Irish literary revival talks about. There's also the phrase associated with that is the Celtic twilight, when they were looking back to traditional models and traditional stories. And the one manuscript we have in the next slide it takes a story out of that tradition. So one of his earliest published poems, called The Stolen Child, it was published in 1886 in the Irish Monthly Magazine when he was just 21. This manuscript of it is the earliest published version. Came out this way a couple of through a few anthologies and so on, but the first time he really had editorial control of a book, he tweaked it slightly. But this is the oh yes, thanks, Emily. Emily mentioned that this is the song that was playing when you came in. So the first I've just transcribed here just the first stanza of this poem down to the break, 2/3 of the way down the page. This is one version of the story, or many stories that involve the children stolen by fairies. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the woods and waters wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Later on, you may know the better known version. He tweaked it to the come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild. And the last verse is on the next slide. It is not on the next slide. That's fine. In the interest of time, we will let you look it up. It is, you will find the whole poem at poets.org, the Academy of American Poets, as well as many other places online. So let's go back on to our next writer, James Joyce. Yeats and Joyce knew each other and admired each other's work very much, although Yeats is really kind of responsible for Joyce's leaving Ireland. Joyce knew early on he wanted to be a writer. He published a book of poems, Chamber Music. He tried to get his book of short stories, Dubliners, published, and Yeats and the Celtic literary revival had such a hold on the literary establishment in Ireland that he could not get published. It wasn't simply the influence of Yeats. Certainly the moral influence of the Catholic Church and the general situation of Irish culture at the time really was not extremely receptive to Joyce's view, unlike Wilde, who noted that one's life should be a work of art, and artificiality is a high compliment. Joyce felt every part of life, just as it is fit material for art. The point of art isn't to make things beautiful, it's to be honest. And Andrew is waving at me. Yes.
So Elizabeth, while the purple twilight of Yeats is still in the air, we have a comment from Rosalind that the poem "The Stolen Child" was carved on the door in the science lab in the movie AI, Artificial Intelligence, where the lifelike android child is taken away by a mecha man. Rosalind says, "I watched it twice but didn't see it credited." But what an inspiring use of a very eerie poem.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. That's
Thanks
fantastic.
For that out, Rosalind.
Yeah. Certainly we will we will see Irish nationalism and Irish culture reflected in Joyce's work. He is, by the way, our first Catholic writer. He is he was being younger than the others. He was born at a time when there were beginning to be more opportunities in education for Catholics. The University College Dublin was founded. Trinity College Dublin, been around for several centuries. The Protestant university, University College Dublin, finally admitted Catholics. So he is Irish as opposed to Anglo-Irish, but very, very much a love-hate relationship with Ireland and Irishness. He left at Ireland when he was 22, after having persistent difficulties with getting Dubliners published. He moved to Europe and lived in various places in Europe for the rest of his life. We have extensive Joyce holdings at the Rosenbach. We are one of the centers of Joyce studies, thanks to the manuscript of Ulysses, and we have added to that a number of things since Dr. Rosenbach's day. The manuscript we'll see on the next page.
Elizabeth, I'm not
yes.
sure if you were planning on addressing this, but Linda asked how the Rosenbachs acquired the manuscript.
Yes. Yep. We are just about to talk about that. So I know I'm doing things in the right sequence. If people ask questions, I am just ready to answer. The manuscript is kept in six cloth covered boxes here, which you'll see in the East Library if you come for a tour. Most of it is written on these individual sheets of paper. It has various things have been written about it, and it's complicated to say exactly what it is, how it relates to the published text. It is the only there are pieces, there are some versions of some chapters that exist in other libraries, but this is the only one that has a complete version of every episode. While he was still writing it, it was being published in the in magazines, in the Little Review from New York and in the Egoist in London. But partway through that process of publication, the magazine was shut down for running afoul of American obscenity laws. So he was moving around Europe, and some things were published in magazines, and then bringing them back and revising them again for publication as a final book. So every chapter has a little bit different. The manuscript is a bit different relationship to the different published versions. Dr. Joyce sold the manuscript while he was still, as he was finishing the writing of the whole book. He sold it to John Quinn, an Irish-American lawyer and collector of art and books and manuscripts, who bought things from artists as a way of subsidizing their work. In 1920, he bought it about 1921. Excuse me. The book came out in early 1922, and 2 years later, Quinn sold his collection at auction, and Dr. Rosenbach, who was not especially interested in contemporary literature, but knew what would last. He knew literature, and he knew this was going to be one of the great books. So he felt he owed it to his reputation as the world's greatest bookseller to buy it. He did buy it at auction, and it has been in Philadelphia ever since. So let's, good night, Rasheen, thanks. Yes. let's look at the next slide and jump ahead just a little bit, then we'll return to the manuscript. After the magazines stopped publishing his unfinished book, Joyce was really despairing of getting it published completely, because no publisher in the English-speaking world was going to print something that was already deemed obscene by the courts. But he was living by that time in Paris and had become friendly with Sylvia Beach, an American expatriate who ran an English language bookshop, Shakespeare and Company. She believed in Joyce. She believed this book needed to be published. She had never published a book before, but that was no obstacle. And she indulged him and shepherded it through the press, through all the many, many changes he continued to make, even on the proofs. And it came out in 1924, February 2nd, in fact, in time for his 40th birthday. So next year, we'll be celebrating the centennial of the publication of Ulysses. This is a copy of the first edition. We'll look at the title page of the first edition on the next slide, and then very quickly, because I see we've got about a minute left, the one page of the manuscript. This is a section from the Cyclops episode, in which our one of our protagonists, Leopold Bloom, will the next slide come up, has wandered into a pub where an Irish nationalist figure known just as the Citizen is holding forth with a bunch of his pals. The Citizen is a rather unpleasant character, and dedicated very much to the independence of his people and their release from economic and cultural oppression, and so on, and laudable, all laudable things, but he's not a pleasant person, and he is not pleasant to Bloom, who is Jewish. Bloom, being a very peaceable sort of person, just manages to stay out of his way. But actually, before their run-in, we have a little passage in which, next slide, we'll see the section of the story we're about to look at, blown up just a little. I won't make you read this passage, but they are, we'll see in just a minute. We'll print it out. We'll get a transcription up right here. They're reading the newspapers, and there is a story about a scandal in the British Navy. They are flogging cadets on the training ships. And these cadets these are kids, these are tweens. They're not college students like our like today's naval cadets. Not that one should be flogging anybody, but here's the next, if we can have the next slide. So that's your glorious British Navy, says the Citizen that bosses the earth. The fellows that never will be slaves rule Britannia. Britons never will be slaves. With the only hereditary chamber in Europe, and their hands in the land in the hands of a dozen game hogs and cotton ball barons. That's the great empire they boast about of drudges and whipped serfs, on which the sun never rises, says Joe. They take on the popular saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Now, Joyce was no fan of what the British had done in Ireland, and not a fan particularly of imperial oppression or any kind of oppression, but neither was he a nationalist. He was really a globalist. He lived most of his adult life in Europe. He was very deeply influenced by European literature. Among the great influences in Ulysses are the Bible and Shakespeare and Dante. So he's not in total sympathy with either side of this argument. And one final comment which the citizen has to say about the subjects of this empire. Next slide. He says the tragedy of it is they believe it. They believe in this empire. The unfortunate yahoos believe it. Having brought that full circle then with the word Yahoo, I will thank you for coming, and just encourage you to visit the Rosenbach. Andrew's already put up links in the chat to a number of things. On the left, you'll see the picture from our yearly celebration of Bloomsday, June 16th, which is all about Ulysses. Last year, it was online. You'll find recordings there, and we'll be doing it again online this year. You have a lot of other ways to find out about us at rosenbach.org and on our social media, for which you'll find links on the page. And next slide, you can our next program is one of our next online programs. Certainly visit Godmother of Goth on Mary Shelley is our next Behind the Bookcase tour, and we have some new things to add to our very recent additions to our Mary Shelley holdings. We are also having a virtual, we run a number of courses, and one of our new virtual courses starting up, maybe especially interest to this audience, a course on writing Irish women. Sive Walsh, an Irish writer who has collaborated with us for a while on Bloomsday and other programs, will be teaching this course, which should be a lot of fun. And please do visit the Rosenbach. We are open again by appointment and at limited times. Of course, you can find all the information on our webpage. You can take a tour. You can see exhibitions. We have an exhibition open now. Our research services right now are available online. Staff is we're answering questions to the extent that we can online. We are looking forward to the time when we can reopen for research in person, but keep your eye on our webpage, and it will tell you how and when you can do that. All of our programs are made possible by people who support us financially. We love to bring free programs to you. Of course, they're not free to produce, so we'd love it if you consider making a donation of $15 or any size now. You can participate as a member. Your donation of membership at various levels will help us create more programs. Membership also gives you opportunities to get in on more kinds of programs and events. So again, the website, the link there will tell you how to do that. Thank you so very much.
And we will keep the meeting going for a little while so that you all can sort through all the different links in the chat. But thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Very glad to do it, and look forward to seeing you online and in person when we can. I should mention yes, there is a link on the website under research for sending in questions. So if you have any further questions about what we talked about tonight or anything else, do send them in. Thanks.
Child to water, go away, child to water and the wild. With a fairy for the world's more full of weeping than you can stand. Where dips the rocky highland of Smoothwood and the Lake? There lies the leafy island, where flattened earth wait the drowsy water life. There we hail fairy vats, frog berries, and the reddest fallen cherries. Go away, human child, to the water. Go away, human child, to the water and the wild. With the fairy for the world's more full of weeping than you can stand. Where the wave of moonlight passes the gangly sands with light, far off by furthest crosses, we footed all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has taken flight to another being. Chasing funky bubbles, while the world is full of troubles, and is anxious in its sleep. Come away, human child, to the water. Come away, human child, to the water and the wild. With a fairy from the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water pushes from the hills above Gilfan, and pools among the bushes that scarcely bear the sky. We see first rumbling sound and whispering in their ears, weeping their white dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the lonely streams. Away with us he is going, the solemnite. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kittle on the arm, sing peace into his breast, or sailing down by his spine, around and around the chest. Four tons of acorns to the child, they flew inside to the water. Bombs, child, human child, clean water, and oil. Where a fairy and fairy from a world more full of weeping, and you can understand, and you can understand, child. Understand.